Hey, good evening, everybody. It's Kentario, and I'm back again with Christ and comic books. So, what I'm looking to talk about today is I was actually looking to speak on Volume 3 of Death Note. However, I am finished with it, but I don't want to go there just yet. Because the last video I did on Death Note, I ended that by inquiring with everybody on who they think light represents, as far as from a possibly spiritual. You could talk from any other religion, but from what perspective do you think light is representing? Because I had already pointed out that, for at least for me, from observing the story and reading so far, that L represents Jesus Christ. He's a very Christ-like figure in the way that he carries himself. One of the aspects that I pointed out with that is the way that how he kept himself separate for a long period of time. And just like the Messiah Jesus did, he ended up finally revealing himself, where, just like in this story, no one's ever seen L, but this is an instance because the threat is so big that now it's time for L to actually be on the battlefield, which was just like Jesus. He came at the right time to reveal himself to be the savior of the world. So that's really what L represents. And another aspect of this that I wasn't paying close attention to until just now, the reason that, one, he dresses the way that he does, and two, the way that he carries himself, is because the word says in the Bible that he is that we need to be in this world but not of this world. And L carries himself in like manner because he demonstrates his intelligence, and even later in Volume 3 you see him demonstrate his physical capabilities as he has a tennis match against Light. So you get to see both aspects of that. But although he's demonstrated how qualified he is, he does kind of operate kind of detached in a way, because he'll hold his pencil by the eraser. He won't fully grasp a phone. He holds it like this up to his ear. So it's as if he's not making full contact with the rest of the world. So he is in the world, but he is not of this world. And that's kind of how L carries himself. But that gives him a Christ-like figure. But the bigger question is, if he represents Christ, then who does Light represent, if that is the case? So I've been doing a lot of thinking on that, and I've come up with a lot of ideas. Before I get into that, to kind of touch on Ryuk, I did point out in my last video as well that Ryuk is eating an apple, and there's some great symbolism there with him partaking of that apple. And this is where I want to reference Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. And this is where it speaks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where Adam and Eve were not supposed to partake of that tree. But that's what Ryuk is doing, not necessarily by eating of the apple, but it speaks to what he's doing as his character in observing what Light's decisions are and what he chooses to do and the outcomes of those decisions, because he's observing, he's gaining knowledge about humanity. He's gaining knowledge of the good and the evil that human beings are capable of, because we do know Light's intentions, quote unquote, are for the good of mankind, but he's willing to go to a great extent that is not so good to make sure that he fulfills, above all else, what he desires to do. So that's one of the big things where he is gaining knowledge about humanity. He's gaining knowledge of their capability for good and for evil. So that's that symbolism there with him in the apple. But as we get to talk about Light, I've observed that he could possibly be the representation of humanity and what they want to see done for the world. I've considered if he's a representation of the biblical Pharisees and how they were in power and how they were able to, and to an extent, manipulate things the way that they wanted to. And people were blind to the truest of intent behind what they were doing. What they were really just glorifying themselves in the things that they were doing, and they thought they fully understood the things that they were doing. But they always found themselves being trumped by, by Jesus during that time. And that's one of the things that's very important about this series in and of itself is, although L, yes, has demonstrated high intellect and ability to somewhat supersede Light in their battle of the minds, in their battle of, human capability and their humanity, so to speak, Light does kind of, even out between the two. So it's not as if he technically supersedes him. So he's not necessarily a representation of those Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the people that were trying to kill Jesus. So that's where I had to think a little bit harder. It's like, no, he's not them. He's not human beings, because no actual human being truly trumped Jesus either. So it's like, well, who could he be? So I came to the conclusion that he is a representation of who man thinks God should be. That is what Light represents. He represents what man thinks God should be. And so here's that question of, well, what is the supporting material behind that? So one of the things is, Light had came to the conclusion there's so much corruption in the world, The truest of evil needs to die, right? So he started killing off major criminals, criminals that were getting away, criminals that instead of being killed off were allowed to just sit in prison. So the influence behind them, their impact is still frequent in the world, and because they're still alive, that's leading other people to commit smaller crimes, which is why, of course, we still have our little side kills or side robberies, and deception and drug deals and all of those things taking place, is because the influence is still out there, because the bigger ones that are starting the whole thing aren't being taken down or handled. At least that's the perspective for the story. And even more so, that might be the perspective of humanity in and of themselves, is that there's so much evil. Where is God dealing with that evil? So that is a representation of who Christ or God should be versus the image of who he truly is. So that's something that I think is very important to identify when it comes to observing who light is. Some other supporting evidence for that is as humanity continues to grow and develop and learn the new things that they are learning, our intellect is increasing. Our knowledge is growing. The way that we're understanding the world is increasing. So one of the dangerous things about that is we get to a point to where we operate as if we don't need God. So in this case, when we're talking light against the system that has already been established, is that I can supersede that system. I can supersede Christ. I can supersede God. I can supersede Christianity. I can supersede that relationship. So that's the image that's being portrayed here through light. Now, that's some of the details that I've observed from reading to support as to whether or not light actually represents, the image of what people believe God should actually be. So again, to really enhance that a little bit more, you notice that he isn't afraid to contend with El. He was willing to take on El. Now, this stems from people being willing to contend with who Jesus is, being that they don't believe that Jesus was who he said he was. He did some nice things. He did some great things. That's even speaking to El before he revealed himself to the other detectives in the NPA. He saw some great cases. He's shown himself to be, great and intellectual. But as far as him being what the world needs for salvation, that is what comes up for question. And even more so, whether or not, the NPA is trusting him, the people of the world will be trusting him, whether light can even trust him to be the guy to carry it out. We can already tell he doesn't trust him to be the one to carry out true justice. That's why light's taking it in his own hands. The danger of humans' imagination is that humanity will always think up, strategize, come up with, or work towards trying to have a world without God. Now, there was a great writer by the name of Nietzsche. I actually looked to get his book and read it, but I believe it's called God is Dead. And what he points out in that, and this is just me summarizing from what I've listened to, because I've listened to Jordan Peterson talk about his book. I've heard several other people speak on his book. Ravi Zacharias has mentioned his book a couple of times. I think Matt Dillahunty has mentioned him. There are several different people that I listen to kind of understand both sides, understand the way that, Christians are seeing things, to understand the way psychologists are seeing things, to even understand the way that atheists are seeing things. So I watch and I listen to a lot of different material. I even listen to Sam Harris as well to try and gather some information. So with what I was saying with that, with what Nietzsche is saying in his book God is Dead, is he's speaking about how we are coming to this point where there is a separation from God. If there's a dying to having that faith in God, and at least it's becoming very minimal. And if we are going to be killing off God, then we have to start from scratch. We're going to have to refresh to be able to build a better world. You can't just kill off God and take what God has brought into this world, what influence he has had, and call yourself having established your own. If you're going to kill off God, you're killing off everything that he has made in the process of that. And that somewhat even speaks to what light is doing, because the risks that he's willing to take does contend with the system that has been established to contend with justice, or to contend with criminal behavior, with evil. And so with him taking that route is as if he's saying the system that you already have is dead. And so although it doesn't demonstrate necessarily whether or not he has his own idea of what that new system will be if he fulfills everything that he's looking to do, it does demonstrate he has the mental capacity to possibly, quote unquote, I say quote unquote, because I don't genuinely, personally believe it's possible to have a life without the Lord, to have a life without God, to have a system without God, to have a functioning society without the Lord being involved in some way. I don't believe that's possible. So that's something very important to mention. But he does demonstrate a high intellect that would make people trust in him. Now, as I bring this video to a close, this is a foreshadowing into how Volume 3 is going to end and what else is going to be introduced as we get ready to get into Volume 4. So I do thank you guys for watching this video. I thank you for listening in as we talk about who light might represent when we're talking about L being a Christ-like figure for this story. Then what does light represent? I would like to get some feedback from you guys on what you think light represents. On even if you think maybe, am I on the right track with thinking that light might represent the image of God that people would like him to be? Not one that just allows for evil to just continue in this world, but one that will contend with evil. And just to bring that defense to my Lord and Savior, I do need to do that, by the way. You can't just get rid of evil. It's not that simple. We would like for it to be that simple, but it's not that simple. Are you asking him to be selective? Are you asking him to deal with all evil? There has to be an understanding behind those things. Even that is kind of what's evident throughout the story, as we'll get into Volume 3 later. But that's something that you really need to be thinking about. Our God is the truest and living God, because he's not going to be the God that we imagine him to be, but he is going to be the truest living God there is. One thing that I want to bring about with that, if you ever look at the story of Abraham, which is, of course, in Genesis, I believe it's chapter 17 when Abraham is living his life and he's trying to be obedient to God. But as God goes to establish a covenant with him, he doesn't simply just give him promise after promise after promise with him. Of course, yes, there are several instances where he's saying, I'm going to make you a man of many nations. I'm going to allow for you to have a son. You're going to be able to be at peace with your ancestors. He's telling him all these things, but he does forewarn him of a coming enslavement that will take place with his people. They will be in a land that's not known to them. They will be put into slavery for 400 years. And even more so, after the promise of that, you actually witness the children of Israel go into slavery. Now, of course, in part, that does stem from their own behavior. But God is honest about what suffering is coming. God's not going to deny us truth. And the truth is, we're going to go through things. We're going to have to contend with evil, whether it be through our neighbor who is doing evil things, whether it be through people getting away for the evil that they are doing. But he is not going to be selective as to who is evil and who is good when he is handling those things. That's why there is his grace, because even when it comes to a little white lie that is deserving of death, but God demonstrates grace. Even the act of violence against someone that may even take their life, the Lord makes the decision as to whether or not he will demonstrate his grace. Not man's interpretation of grace, not what anyone can guess that grace is, but it is God's grace that determines whether or not someone will be, suffer for their sins or not. And we leave that all to the Lord. But the most powerful thing about it is, no matter what evil action we take, we're all deserving of death. But he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to be that sacrifice so that no one has to perish. So that is one of the truest and most powerful things. And again, to reiterate that verse, to be in this world, but not of this world. This world is dead already. But if we're living as if we're not of this world, living according to the will and the way of the Lord, willingly and obediently, then we will see the fullness of life that we can have here before we go to join him in heaven. Thank you guys, and y'all have a blessed evening. Good night.